I'm Lisa Snyderman, and this is Conversations on Creating to Heal. Today, I'm happy to be speaking with Suzanne Edison from Seattle, Washington, a poet, educator, therapist, and mother of a daughter with juvenile myositis. Her story is using her writing and creativity to process emotions, engage others, as well as raise awareness. So, welcome, Suzanne.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi. So, for people who don't know you, maybe can you describe a little bit about who you are artistically, and if you might have a mission or purpose for some of these artistic hats you wear?
Currently, I'm a poet and I'm an educator, and I have been writing for many years. But what shifted me was when my child was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disease about 12 years ago. And so my writing took a completely different turn at that point. And I started writing about my journey as a parent with a child who had a very rare disease, and that was my salvation. So I also really needed a support group, and I couldn't find one, and so I started one at Seattle Children's Hospital, and that sort of morphed from a talking group into a writing workshop because I discovered that writing was really important to me as a way of processing and managing and advocating and thinking through all these feelings, and I thought it would be really useful for other people. So I've been doing that work both in a hospital setting, clinic settings, with adults, with teenagers who have chronic illness, and now I teach also in a literary school called Richard Hugo House in Seattle. And I've been doing a lot of writing, poetry, mostly over the years.
Wonderful. Well, it's great that you have an avenue, that and an outlet that you've been able to turn to. But I want to talk about your story a little more. I want to understand some of the events that may have transpired that maybe brought you, to seek out some of this, the writing and the poetry. So you talk a little bit about your daughter. Can you describe what juvenile myositis is for people who may not know, and maybe some of the day-to-day things that she goes through in her life?
Sure. Juvenile myositis is a disease of the vascular system. So anywhere your blood goes, it attacks your muscles, your organs, your skin, and lots of the hallmarks of the disease. The common symptoms are fatigue, muscle weakness, and rashes. Those are the basics, but there's a huge continuum along which kids and teenagers exist and experience this illness. And much of the first line interventions are high doses of steroids and chemotherapy drugs in a lower dose than what cancer kids would get, but it's called methotrexate, and you have to inject it. As a parent, I had to give her weekly shots. Initially, she was hospitalized for 3 days at a time, and then every other week she would go in for these massive infusions of steroids, and eventually we had to add immunoglobulins to that. And for about 5 months initially, when she was 6 years old, none of the drugs were really working, and she was getting worse. And she was bloated from the steroids because it causes Cushingoid syndrome. So you get really puffy cheeks, and you put on a lot of weight, and you're pretty uncomfortable. And for her, she also got compression fractures in her spine, so she was in a lot of pain. She was unable to walk very well. She couldn't run without falling down. Initially, she couldn't really go upstairs without holding onto a banister. She had to push herself up off the floor.
Sounds
And
like a hard way to have a life as a kid. You're already dealing with all of the things that kids have to deal with, and then on top of it, to have all these medical, issues. So what was the support and also just the processing like for her? What was that like?
There wasn't much for her either, but eventually I found this national organization called Cure JM Foundation, and they started having conferences, family conferences. So eventually I could bring her to those where she could meet other kids with the same disease. We didn't know, it took us a while to find kids in our city who also had the same illness. I'm not sure it was a huge support for her initially. I think just trying to get out of pain was important. I was trying to keep everything pretty normal, so going to school as much as she could and still hanging out with the friends that she already had. And then also having to try to explain to them and their families and to the school, you know, what kind of accommodation she would need, but and also a little bit about the disease. So those were kind of the supports for her.
And then what about for you? What was that like for you as a caretaker and a parent?
It was really overwhelming. I mean, I was anxious and worried. I didn't know if, you know, if she was going to get better or worse. It was a long time to get to the diagnosis. So before that, I had already had about 1.5 years of tremendous anxiety and worry that she might not live. And so that in some ways the diagnosis was a relief, but I didn't really know what was going to come. So then all of the, you know, not sleeping, not eating well, also being fairly isolated from my other friends and family. Nobody really had ever heard of this disease. Pretty rare. So I would say the other thing that she and I did a lot together was we did a lot of drawing, we did a lot of crafts, we did knitting, going to the swimming pool because she could, you know, kind of get in the water and have a little bit both of exercise and get out of the house.
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, for the viewers, I also shared the same disease as an adult, dermatomyositis, and so for myself, it's a journey of trying to find ways to live in my place of joy. So I imagine, you know, it's doing the same thing, you know, when you can find something that that makes you feel good, where you don't have to think about all of the, you know, the hospitals and the day-to-day reality, that must be nice. And for you too. So maybe talk a little bit about the kinds of projects that you've been doing and what kinds of results, in other words, how has creating or, you know, sharing some of your poetry, what kind of impact has that had?
Well, initially the writing was just for me because I didn't know where it was going to go. It wasn't anything like I had been doing before. It was just I really just needed to get it out of me and put it down on paper. And then eventually I began to shape them into poems, and I realized in sharing them with a few other people that it really had an impact. And there wasn't a lot of writing out there about from a parent's point of view about having a chronically ill kid. And I felt like that was important to try to get out both to people who had kids, but also to the medical world and caretakers and people that we came in contact with who didn't really understand what it was like, what we were going through as family members. So my first project really was to interview parents who had kids with chronic illness. And I had started this writing workshop already, so I interviewed them, and then I wrote a series of poems based on those interviews. I had gotten some grant money to do it, and we published a bunch of small little chapbooks of poems, and then distributed them in the clinics where kids were seen, to some of the groups of the families who, they didn't all have juvenile myositis. Some of them had arthritis, some of them had Crohn's disease, a few other, you know, autoimmune diseases. And I just got a lot of great response, both from doctors and from families. And I thought, well, I think I've found this niche where, you know, nobody's really paying attention. And also I have a background as a psychotherapist. So I felt like emotionally, I knew that this was important for people to be able to work through. I also had been doing some research about what happens to parents who have kids with chronic illness and the kind of traumas that we go through, and the ability for us to then have to be there for our kids all the time, but what do we do about our own feelings? So that was part of what was going through my mind in both starting the support group, the writing groups, and doing my own work. And then I decided that I wanted to expand that project. That was a couple of years ago, and I got this crazy idea that I would interview researchers and doctors and nurses and more patients and caretakers in a variety of different autoimmune diseases, and publish this book of poetry and visual art, and eventually maybe do a video and a series of readings. And again, I got lots of great support for it, lots of grants that I wrote where people were pretty enthusiastic. And I partnered with this research organization called the Benaroya Research Institute in Seattle.
Yes.
So that's been my newest.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that. So that is, you said it's a combination of poetry, visual art. Now, is the topic of the poetry autoimmune disease, or are they people that have illnesses, but it isn't necessarily the topic of their poems?
So it's not their poems. I'm channeling
Your poems.
They're
Yes.
all my poems.
Ah, yes.
I did all the interviews.
Yes.
And each of them was an hour long. I did 28 different interviews, and we videotaped most of them. Some of them we had to only do audio because people were out of town. And then as a result of those interviews and transcripts and what I heard and notes that I took, I wrote 16 poems or more, but 16 are in the book. And so the voices come from, it's a partially channeling the people that I interviewed and funneling it through my own imagination and my own understanding and whatever creative work that people do. I think you know what that's like. The visual art in the poetry book also came from people who either work at the Research Institute, who are also artists, or maybe some of the parents who are artists, and even one of the kids that I interviewed. So it's a real compilation, I think, of different voices and visions. And I'd be happy to read one of the poems.
Wonderful.
It's called When My Child Fell Ill. When my child fell ill, what didn't kill me left me drained as bleached coral, spongiform, a holy mess in unmapped reefs. What didn't kill me lassoed years from sleep, stole cabinets of dreams, chewed up the storylines where monsters never stray from closets or else disappear by morning. Other mothers fretted over pox and croup, buzzed about their soccer stars, piano prodigies. Well-wishers sent their remedies, saying, leave it to God, and stayed away. What didn't kill put no substance on my frame, did not gift me a badge or crown, did not ennoble. Stripped and salted, I left God in her wheelhouse, wandered the overlit corridors of medicine, challenged their priests and litanies. You've prayed for the day when you turn to see your child, still swollen with drugs, but flinging sand into buckets, giving her dolls a castled home, and like Galileo with his telescope, finally finding the multiple moons of Jupiter, her illness reveals itself, one part of a larger constellation, Ursa Major, well known to you, but not the brightest star.
Your imagery, your words, they do wonders for just capturing the essence.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Yeah. So before we go, I just want to ask if you might have some life lessons, either for parents who are dealing with children, that are chronically ill, or somebody going through something similar.
I think there's so many. I think two of the biggest things are seek support. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Everybody needs it. And many people are willing to help, they just don't know how. So the more concrete you can be about what would be useful and helpful to you, the better. And find things that really give you joy. So make sure that the illness isn't the only thing that you see in your child and isn't the only thing that drives your family.
Seek support and find and live in your place of joy. Thank you for coming on to Conversations on Creating to Heal.
Thank you.